Yeah, unfortunately, I started recording just before you did that. um, Good evening and welcome to our Friday night Bible study. If you've been paying attention, we updated both the operating system on this computer and the software that we use for streaming. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I get an immediate failed to connect the server message as soon as I click the button to start streaming. So I've been unable to stream. So we're recording the program right now and we'll just have to upload it. It's going to be late, but I've gone through and tried a number of things, including opening a hole through the firewall to allow the software to access the servers. And I don't know if it's a fault with Facebook or us or whatever. I couldn't tell you right now. So we're just going to go ahead and.
It might could use a CAT scan.
You going to send BitBit in for that?
Huh?
Are you going to send BitBit in for that?
I don't know where she is.
Oh, well, at the moment, I don't think I do either. So.
The shed, it could be full of dander.
Yeah. The kind of big news this week was actually news when we streamed last week, and I just hadn't seen it yet. And that is the flooding in Texas and now also in New Mexico. And you may have seen notes about the flood in the Kerrville area of Texas. It's north and a little west of San Antonio, where one of the places that got highly damaged and where people died was a girls' camp alongside the river. And I saw a note today that the owner of the camp had been saying something for some time that he wanted warnings about flooding on the river. And he apparently died in this event. Later in the week, this was actually, like I say, had already happened when we streamed last week, and I just wasn't aware of it. Since then, they've had flooding in New Mexico, and there is a horse track. I assume, given the name, that it's a harness racing track with the little carriages, like at Batavia Downs in New York, was a track I knew about. Only in this case, it was Ruidoso Downs in New Mexico. The Downs is actually a little ways east of the town of Ruidoso in New Mexico, but apparently they've had to move a race that was scheduled there to some other place this weekend because of the flooding. So that's what's been going on. Shortly after I started going this morning, I got an email. I don't know when it actually came in. I didn't see the date on it or the time on it, but it was from the organization for whom I answer Bible questions, and they had a question for me. So I'm going to go through that right now because I did finish an answer and send it out earlier today. The question comes from Shell. The drying up of the Euphrates River, is this a prophecy for the end times? From what I've read, it seems to be the case, but no one in our churches seems to be preaching about it. Well, maybe they don't anymore. I don't know. My dad used to preach about it. I remember what he had to say, and what I write in here will be based in part on what I learned from him. Anyway, dear Shell, thank you for visiting our site and for submitting your question about the Euphrates River in Revelation. The passage in question comes from Revelation 16, the description of the 7 bowls of God's wrath. Recall that God's wrath involves letting us suffer the natural consequences of our foolish choices. See Romans 1:18-32, noting the repeated line, gave them over. You ask if this has to do with the end times. Revelation 15:1 calls these plagues the last plagues because with them God's wrath is completed. I think that quite clearly indicates these are end time events. As they are in the book of Revelation, these things are symbolic representations of reality and should not be taken literally. It would be possible, in the typical evangelical interpretation of Bible prophecy, to take the sixth plague literally, where the Euphrates River dries up, making it easier for Israel's enemies, particularly Iran, to attack Israel. But in modern warfare with missiles and cyber attacks, the river poses little, if any, hindrance to attacks on Israel. Let's read the full description. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east. Then I saw three evil spirits that looked like frogs. They came out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. They are spirits of demons performing miraculous signs, and they go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them for battle on the great day of God Almighty. Behold, I come like a thief. Blessed is he who stays awake and keeps his clothes with him, so that he may not go naked and be shamefully exposed. Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. That's Revelation 16:12-18 out of the New International Version, and it's the entire description of the sixth plague. The evil spirits exiting the mouths of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet, each symbols themselves, clarify that we should interpret this passage symbolically. I have heard a lot of attempts to parse out these symbols. Let me share some of them and provide my personal take. First, in Revelation, water stands for people. See chapter 17, verse 15. The drying up of the river suggests that a certain people group vanishes. In the end time, as events convince people to make up their minds about eternal issues and quit sitting on the fence, the people who have no loyalty to either good or evil vanish. This prepares the way. But for whom? Many interpretations link the kings from the east here with the evil kings bent on destroying God's people. But in the Old Testament, the trouble comes from the north, not the east. East could mean the direction of sunrise or the day star, a symbol of Christ. Revelation 1:6 says Jesus made us kings, or a kingdom, and priests to God. Taken this way, the kings from the east might represent God's faithful followers. Recall the story in Matthew of kings who came from the east. What about these spirits? They come from the mouths of these symbols. What comes from mouths? Words. Later in Revelation 20, when the final confrontation resumes after the second resurrection, Satan goes out to deceive the nations and gather them for battle. So we could easily see these evil or unclean spirits as the lies Satan and his agents use to turn people against God. The kings mentioned later in the passage come from the whole world, not just from the east. These are the ones gathered for battle. The kings from the east, taking our interpretation above, cannot be deceived. See Matthew 24:24. Those who aren't deceived won't gather. Some people believe the term Armageddon may also symbolize something. Specifically, they suggest it may actually mean Har Megiddo, or the hill of Megiddo. Megiddo is a city southeast of Mount Carmel. In this interpretation, the Battle of Armageddon has a form similar to the confrontation between the Creator and the false gods of Israel that took place in the days of Elijah. Others point out that when Darius the Mede diverted the river around Babylon, causing the riverbed through the city to dry up, the city was destroyed and King Belshazzar died. While God's people are not agents of death, their rescue may involve the death of their persecutors. What I find interesting is that the battle doesn't take place here. The kings of the earth gather for battle, but John doesn't mention any fighting taking place. Instead, he describes the events of the seventh bowl, accompanied by the proclamation, "It is done." I take it that the kings are intent on battle, but are interrupted when God stops them. So the Battle of Armageddon, to the extent that it takes place at all, gets delayed to the end of the 1,000 years of chapter 20. We read in chapter 19 that the kings of the earth gather to make war against the rider on the horse, which represents Jesus. But the only sense in which any battle takes place then is that the beast and the false prophet are captured, and the rest die by the sword that comes from the mouth of the rider on the white horse. Again, what comes from the mouth? Words. The rider on the white horse, also called faithful and true, would speak words of truth. Truth, spoken in terms that the deceived can no longer deny, creates a destructive moment of self-revelation that leads the hearers to actively seek death. See Revelation 6:16, where the people call for the rocks and the mountains to fall on them and hide them from the wrath of the Lamb. To summarize, the dried up river may represent the loss of the undecided masses as world events convince people to make up their minds either for or against the Creator. The battle itself represents the attempts of the world's powerful people to force their will onto all the masses, including God's followers. The weapons in this war are the lies the powerful tell to make evil look good and good look evil. Those who ground themselves in the eternal reality of God's love won't believe those lies, making them the targets of those who demand compliance to social norms. Some interpreters go on to suggest that when it seems all hope is lost for these dissidents, God intervenes and rescues them. This vindicates those who believe truth or reality. There are universalists who believe that in the end God will save everyone. I don't subscribe to that viewpoint because I believe God restricts himself to acting in love. Love does not use force. Yes, God has the power to heal all broken humans, but that involves changing character, an intensely intimate work God won't force anyone to submit to. Passages like the ones we're examining in Revelation suggest strongly that many, possibly billions, will cease to exist completely, having chosen to separate themselves from the source of life, the Creator. For that reason, I personally reject universalism. May the Creator bless you, and may your study of His Word lead you to trust Him so fully He can heal and save you. Sincerely, me. So I see that the last time I read a question and answer to you, I left it here. So I'll stack these up and set them aside to be put away later. One little thing, just a few minutes here. I try to vary what I use when I practice the piano. Some of you know I have my well, it was my mother's, but before that it was my grandmother's baby grand piano, manufactured sometime between 1895 and 1900, in the living room right next to me here, and I do play it on occasion to keep what few skills in playing I actually have. Like I say, I like to vary what I play, and recently I got this book out. This is a Christmas cantata published, let's see if it says here in the front cover. It doesn't. This one has been, oh yeah, you can see it here. Lorenz Publishing Company, Dayton, Ohio. And you may be aware, we've looked that up, Lorenz went out of business around 2020 when the pandemic forced churches to cancel in-person services and to cancel choir practice. Well, if the choirs weren't practicing, then the choir directors weren't buying music for their choirs to practice. And so all of a sudden the business, and Lorenz was a company that focused on church music. Their market kind of dried up on them, and they were not financially prepared to weather the storm, and they folded. They did make provisions to see to it that their composers received the royalties due them, but then they folded and went out of business. This one, however, wasn't, while it is from that, it's actually delivered by this company. And I don't know if I can hold that up close enough where you can see it, but that actually says 314 South Elm, Denton, Texas. Now, some of you may know where Denton, Texas is. It's essentially north of Fort Worth. It's located approximately where the two divided Interstate 35 sections, east and west, come back together on the north side of the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area. And the company, I looked it up, the company's still there. They still have an active website, and they still provide music, but they're not just church music. Church music is one of the things they do, but they also do band music and just general music for all sorts of purposes. And so they managed, with some reductions, to weather that pandemic problem. They're still in business, but as far as I can tell, they're only in business there. Now, on the back of this thing, there are some other locations listed here. They mentioned Denton, Houston, and Oklahoma City. I looked up both Houston and Oklahoma City. They're not there anymore. But I did find something interesting about the Houston one. The Houston business, by the way, this was sent out. You can see an address on the back here. That's Trinity Lutheran Church, Ironwood, Michigan. My mother used to live in Ironwood, and so she probably got that through connections with the people at the Lutheran Church there. At any rate, this was a promotional copy mailed out to convince church choir directors, hey, maybe you want to buy this from us so your choir can perform this cantata this Christmas. This was in 2005. In 2008, Pender Music decided to close its Houston location. So apparently the sheet music business was already contracting that far back. And a person who had been a student there and who had become a concert pianist heard about that and bought the thing for himself and ran it for quite a few years. And I don't have exact information on it. I did find some reviews of the store. Most of them were negative, but I think the negative ones came just before the store closed. Now, this man put his own money into buying the store and running it. But that wasn't his main thing. He was a concert pianist. He traveled the nation. He's performed in New York City. So he's I forget the name right now, but he's a known U.S. performer. And so the music store wasn't his entire business. And the reviews suggested he got a little bit touchy with some of his customers toward the end, and that may just have reflected his frustration at having invested in this business, trying to keep it going for the people of the community, and not getting the kind of support from the community that he was trying to help out that would allow him to keep the thing in business. And so it eventually closed and folded. Just an interesting thing I ran across, and we probably wasted more time on things like that than we should have. So let's bow our heads and we'll get going. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for your blessings to us. We thank you that we have this time, that you sent us a written word with which we might become better acquainted with you. As we open that word this evening and examine what has been written there, send your Holy Spirit to help us find, even in the hard to find places, glimpses of your grace and glory. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. One of the things I did today, I had seen different streaming people do different things to switch from one scene to another, and I wanted to play around with that. Well, this is open source software that I'm using because, we don't make money off this. I don't see any sense in spending money to not make money, so I use the open source stuff. But so I'm gonna do this and just see what it looks like. Wasn't exactly what I wanted, but and it's not nearly as flexible as I would have liked. But anyway. So here we are. We're ready. I last week when we streamed, I made the mistake of saying we were starting at 2 Kings 21 because that's what I had open when I first started setting up the stream. But actually, we are only just now getting to 2 Kings 21. And we talked a little bit last week about Hezekiah and the end of his reign and all the nonsense that took place after he got those additional 15 years. I had at one time thought that Manasseh, being 12 years old when he became king, wasn't born until after that. However, the information I'm able to get suggests that Manasseh co-reigned with his father for about 12 years. So he would have started at 12 years old, about 3 years after his father got that life extension that we read about that involved the shadow going backwards. And so then he co-reigned with his father until he was 24 when his father died, and he took over entirely on his own. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 55 years. The longest previous reign was Josiah, who reigned 52. So Manasseh has the longest reign of any of the kings of the southern kingdom, the kings in the line of David. And then it says his mother was Hephzibah. Now, in the past, when we read about his mother, indicating to me anyway that this woman served as queen mother when her son ascended the throne, it says something about either where she was from or who her father was. This one doesn't say anything. Now, Hephzibah appears here as Manasseh's mother, but the name as a term shows up in the book of Isaiah. And this has led some people to conclude, I would have to say I don't think they can do so with much certainty, but to conclude that Hephzibah was Isaiah's daughter. making Isaiah Manasseh's maternal grandfather. Now, why might that be interesting? Well, there is a tradition in some extra biblical Jewish texts, religious texts, that suggests that Isaiah died at the hands of Manasseh. And the terminology you'll often hear is sawn asunder in a hollow log. And I've run across different explanations for that, one of which was simply that hearing that Manasseh intended to execute him, Isaiah fled Jerusalem, went out into the country, and hid in a hollow tree. Somehow, Manasseh found out about that and ordered the tree cut with a saw, specifically to effect the execution of Isaiah. And then some interpreters will say, well, he killed his maternal grandfather. Well, we can't know that for sure. The Bible doesn't say who this Hephzibah was, and just the fact that the term got used in Isaiah's book does not mean that she was his daughter, at least not to me, anyway. So, reading on, and again, this is in Kings, so this is the perspective of the prophets. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight, following the detestable practices of the pagan nations that the Lord had driven from the land ahead of the Israelites. He rebuilt the pagan shrines his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He constructed altars for Baal and set up an Asherah pole, just as King Ahab of Israel had done. He also bowed before all the powers of the heavens and worshipped them. Now, recall that his paternal grandfather, Ahaz, had formed an alliance with the king of Assyria and had copied an altar that he found in Damascus that the king of Assyria was using, and he sent plans for it down to Jerusalem and had the priests in Jerusalem make an altar like that and to use it in place of the altar that Solomon had prepared. Reading on about Manasseh, he built pagan altars in the temple of the Lord, the place where the Lord had said, "My name will remain in Jerusalem forever." He built these altars for all the powers of the heavens in both courtyards of the Lord's temple. Manasseh also sacrificed his own son in the fire. The footnote will say, caused his son to pass through the fire, which may well have been an Hebrew euphemism for what was actually happening. He practiced sorcery and divination, and he consulted with mediums and psychics. He did much that was evil in the Lord's sight, arousing his anger. Now, I recently, in examining this and some other things, ran across an interpretation that suggests that what Manasseh did served to strengthen his position, particularly against Assyria. Recall, Assyria had threatened his father. They hadn't been able to pull it off, but they had threatened him. And it would have been during Manasseh's reign that Sennacherib's sons assassinated him and then fled, leaving his other son, Esarhaddon, to take his place. They suggest that there were a lot of people in Judah, powerful people, who resented the changes that Hezekiah had made, that wanted to keep their localized religious observances, and that what Manasseh did was simply to reallow that in order to get the support from these people that his father had lost, in order to strengthen himself against Assyria. Of course, as we know, ultimately Assyria wasn't the threat that Judah would need to be worried about, but go on, we'll read on here. We finished verse 6 there. Whoops, scroll down the wrong thing. Where's my... I keep scrolling what I don't want to scroll. Manasseh even made a carved image of Asherah and set it up in the temple, the very place where the Lord had told David and his son Solomon, "My name will be honored forever in this temple and in Jerusalem, the city I have chosen from among all the tribes of Israel. If the Israelites will be careful to obey my commands, all the laws my servant Moses gave them, I will not send them into exile from this land that I gave their ancestors." But the people refused to listen, and Manasseh led them to do even more evil than the pagan nations that the Lord had destroyed when the people of Israel entered the land. Now, whatever might have been the purposes behind what Manasseh did, the prophets at least saw his reign as a negative influence. And we're going to complete reading through this before I share something different from the books of Chronicles. Then the Lord said through his servants the prophets, "King Manasseh of Judah has done many detestable things. He is even more wicked than the Amorites who lived in this land before Israel. He has caused the people of Judah to sin with his idols." So this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: "I will bring such disaster on Jerusalem and Judah that the ears of those who hear about it will tingle with horror." That was a footnote there. Footnote B about idols. Yeah, the Hebrew term, literally round things, probably alludes to dung. They've said that before. I wondered if that might not be what they were going to reference there. Okay, we just read verse 12 where the Lord says through the prophets, or the prophets quote the Lord as saying, "I will bring such disaster on Jerusalem and Judah that the ears of those who hear about it will tingle with horror. I will judge Jerusalem by the same standard I used for Samaria, and by the same measure I used for the family of Ahab. I will wipe away the people of Jerusalem as one wipes a dish and turns it upside down." Footnote C. The same plumb line I used for Samaria, the same plumb bob. All right. Now I want to point something out here because my mother told me about this many, many years ago. I have observed it myself. Modern translations try to undo the gender bias of the Bible's writers. They were raised in highly paternalistic and patriarchal societies and cultures where, men held all the power and men did all the important things. If you read this in the King James, it says, well, let me actually get it up here and read it, because we're in 2 Kings chapter 21. Verse 13, "And I will stretch over Jerusalem the line of Samaria and the plummet of the house of Ahab. And I will wipe Jerusalem as a man wipeth a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down." Now the term man isn't there in the Hebrew, and that's probably one of the reasons why modern translations render that as one. But my mother pointed something out to me. And these are generalizations, so they won't hold true for everybody. More men than women are visually oriented. That's why pornography is more of a problem for men than it is for women. The men are visually oriented, are more likely to be titillated by what they see with their eyes. women are likely to be more intuitive. Now I ask you, in that patriarchal society, how often would a man wipe a dish? It seems to me dish wiping is a household task that in that patriarchal society would have been left to women. So if they're talking about a man wiping a dish, are they maybe suggesting something important? The visually oriented man, when he washes dishes, and I do this myself, and I know how powerful the urge is with me to do it. I wipe the top of the dish, and then I turn it over so I can see the bottom, and I wipe the bottom of the dish. My mother pointed out that at least some women, when they wipe a dish, the top of the dish, the part that they're looking at, that's the one that got dirty when it was used. That's the one they wipe and they wash. But then they reach around behind and they wipe that. That was already clean. It just needs a wipe, really, and it's clean. And so the woman doesn't turn it upside down, but the man does wipe a dish and turn it upside down. Anyway. So that there may have been a reason for the King James to render it as a man wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. Reading on. Then I will reject even the remnant of my own people who are left, and I will hand them over as plunder for their enemies. For they have done great evil in my sight and have angered me ever since their ancestors came out of Egypt. Now we have to read this with an understanding of what God's wrath is. God's wrath takes place when he gives up and lets go and allows us to receive the natural consequences of the choices that we have made. So if his people continue to essentially thumb their noses at the Creator by engaging in these other forms of worship, then God won't intervene when their enemies show up intent on enriching themselves at Israel's expense. For they have done great evil in my sight and have angered me ever since their ancestors came out of Egypt.
Pause just a moment.
Okay, just a moment. Oops, I misinterpreted that. Okay, you wanted me to let you say something.
Well, I just kind of have a feeling that you might be running off and leaving people. You gave the example of the man wiping, having to turn the dish over to wipe both sides, and the woman only wipes the one side.
She doesn't wipe. She wipes both sides. She just doesn't turn it over to wipe the other side. Is what I said.
Well, you may have lost people there because you gave them a point where they're going to be stopping and thinking, "Huh? Now how do I wash dishes?"
All right. How do you
Now,
wash?
you talked about this before. For a long time, I would turn the dish over to wipe it, to look at it and wipe it. But it was my dad that taught me how to wash dishes. And
Interesting.
then older and no longer had him looking over my shoulder, I would kind of cut corners and just wipe it without turning it over and looking. And I discovered that by doing that, I was sometimes leaving a putting away a dirty dish because it had food on the bottom of it, which had gotten there by stacking it up on top of other dirty dishes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, this is absolutely has nothing to do with what you were saying, but it gives people here a chance to stop and think about what they're doing. Now their mind can be clear to go on with what you were saying. Please continue.
Okay. Manasseh also murdered many innocent people until Jerusalem was filled from one end to the other with innocent blood. This was in addition to the sin that he caused the people of Judah to commit, leading them to do evil in the Lord's sight. Well, if, as these interpreters suggested, he was trying to establish himself as a powerful leader that would give him recognition with surrounding rulers, he very well may have murdered a lot of innocent people, including Isaiah, just to assert his authority. Because that's what happens when we start operating by force. The rest of the events in Manasseh's reign and everything he did, including the sins he committed, are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Judah. When Manasseh died, he was buried in the palace garden, the garden of Uzzah. Then his son Amon became the next king. This book does not include anything about Manasseh's capture and his imprisonment in Babylon. That is recorded in the books of Chronicles. When we get to Chronicles and we read that, we'll probably talk a little bit more about why that may be. But I do get the impression from a number of variances that the writers of the books of Chronicles acted to try to resurrect the legacy and the reputation of some of Judah's former kings. And that may have, in fact, reflected their bent towards demonstrating that the Jews were God's people and the Samaritans, or the people of the northern tribes, were not. Reading on now about Amon. Amon was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 2 years. His mother was Meshullemeth, the daughter of Haruz from Jokbal. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight, just as his father Manasseh had done. He followed the example of his father, worshiping the same idols his father had worshipped. He abandoned the Lord, the God of his ancestors, and he refused to follow the Lord's ways. Then Ammon's own officials conspired against him and assassinated him in his palace. But the people of the land killed all those who had conspired against King Amon, and they made Josiah, his son Josiah, the next king. The rest of the events in Ammon's reign and what he did are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Judah. He was buried in his tomb in the garden of Uzzah, probably next to his father Manasseh. Then his son Josiah became the next king. So that's the end of chapter 21 and the story of both Manasseh and Amon. The story of Josiah is quite interesting. Now, you may recall that back in the days of Jehu killed both the king of Israel and the king of Judah in a single day. And when the queen mother, a woman named Athaliah, a daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, saw that her son had been killed, she set about to kill all the members of the royal household in an attempt to establish herself as a new dynasty in Judah. But one of the sisters, I believe, of the king, and there are suggestions that she had also married one of the priests, took one of the boys who was about to be killed away and hid him in the temple for 6 years. So then when this young man, Joash, was 7 years old, they declared him king, assassinated Athaliah, and restored the line of David to the throne of Judah. So Joash became king at 7. Josiah, we read here, became king at 8, only 1 year older. Now, stop to think about that. His dad became king at 22. He reigned for only 22 years. So he was 24 when he died. And his son, at that point, was 8 years old, meaning that Josiah was born when his father, Amon, was only 16. Apparently more common back in those days for things like that to happen. In our culture, we'd say, teenage parents, terrible. They shouldn't be doing that. Well, that's our culture because we've kind of invented prolonged adolescence because of all the other things we demand from people. You were going to say?
It happens.
You mean that young men become fathers at 16?
Yeah.
Yeah, but we think of it as a negative thing. I don't think in that culture that it was such a big deal. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. His mother was Jediah, the daughter of Adiah from Bozkath. He did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight and followed the example of his ancestor David. He did not turn away from doing what was right. Now, I mentioned the story told in Chronicles about Manasseh being taken captive to Babylon and spending some time there in prison and having a conversion experience in prison there in Babylon, and then returning briefly, probably, to Jerusalem. And it is possible, and I've read this suggested, that during that time he was able to train and influence his grandson in a way he was unable to influence his son. And that explains why Josiah did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight. Reading on in the story of Josiah. In the 18th year of his reign, King Josiah sent Shaphan, son of Azaliah, and grandson of Meshullam, the court secretary, to the temple of the Lord. He told him, "Go to Hilkiah the high priest and have him count the money the gatekeepers have collected from the people at the Lord's temple. Entrust this money to the men assigned to supervise the restoration of the Lord's temple. Then they can use it to pay workers to repair the temple. They will need to hire carpenters, builders, and masons. Also have them buy timber and the finished stone needed to repair the temple. But don't require the construction supervisors to keep account of the money they receive, for they are honest and trustworthy men." I could say a lot about that. How much more things could we get done in our society, and how much more cheaply could we do them if we didn't have to keep account of it? We hire accountants. We spend money on accounting software. We spend money on books to keep the records. And we go to all these lengths because we don't trust people. But in this case, Josiah, for whatever reason, whether it was warranted or not, he trusted the men he assigned as construction supervisors. He said, give them the money and let them spend it as they need to accomplish the repairs of the temple. And don't bog them down with having to account for it with the paperwork. They're honest and trustworthy men. Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the court secretary, I have found the book of the law in the Lord's temple. Then Hilkiah gave the scroll to Shaphan, and he read it. Shaphan went to the king and reported, Your officials have turned over the money collected at the temple of the Lord to the workers and supervisors of the temple. Shaphan also told the king, Hilkiah the priest has given me a scroll. So Shaphan read it to the king. When the king heard what was written in the book of the law, this would have been most likely the Pentateuch or the books of Moses, he tore his clothes in despair. And then he gave these orders to Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam son of Shaphan, Achbor son of Micaiah, Shaphan the court secretary, and Asaiah the king's personal advisor. Go to the temple and speak to the Lord for me and for the people and for all Judah. Inquire about the words written in this scroll that has been found. For the Lord's great anger is burning against us because our ancestors have not obeyed the words in this scroll. We have not been doing everything it says we must do. Now, a brief pause there, because that name Shaphan may sound familiar to you. Actually, it wasn't what I thought it was. But at one time, I did some research on this, and I found links between some of the people named here and the people named in Hezekiah's court. I don't see that link right now, so I'll have to maybe do that later. Okay, I don't know how much of this I read. I kind of lost track there. So I'm going to pick up again at verse 12. Then he gave these orders to Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam son of Shaphan, Achbor son of Micaiah, Shaphan the court secretary, and Asaiah the king's personal advisor. Go to the temple and speak to the Lord for me and for the people and for all Judah. Inquire about the words written in this scroll that has been found. For the Lord's great anger is burning against us because our ancestors have not obeyed the words in this scroll. We have not been doing everything it says we must do. So, clearly what has happened here is that the instructions given in Deuteronomy about the king writing a scroll for himself hadn't been followed. Josiah became king at 8. This is the 18th year of his reign, so you put that together, he's now 26. And when the priest finds the book of the law and the king's advisors bring it to him and read it to him, he's never heard it before. He's not aware of what it says. And when he becomes aware of what it says, and when he reads about the blessings and curses referenced there in the book of Deuteronomy, he realizes that the nation hasn't lived up to its side of that bargain. So, Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam, Achbor, Shaphan, and Asaiah went to the new quarter of Jerusalem, footnote A, or the second quarter, a newer section of Jerusalem. Hebrew reads the Mishnah, to consult with the prophet Huldah. She was the wife of Shallum, son of Tikvah, son of Harhas, the keeper of the temple wardrobe. Now, do all versions say the temple wardrobe there? Because I got the impression from having studied this before that it was the royal wardrobe, but I may be way off in La La Land on that one. So let me look it up here.
Well, the way you read that, it sounded to me like the name of the temple was wardrobe.
Oh. Oh, is it? Are you thinking like the fawn in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe?
Yeah, I guess.
I don't
Just
know these places you speak of, wardrobe and spa room.
it just kind of sounded funny. Like the name of the temple was wardrobe.
Yeah. Okay. The son of Harhas, keeper of the wardrobe. So it doesn't say which in this version. This is the NIV. She lived in Jerusalem in the second district. All right. So keeper of the wardrobe, whether it was the temple wardrobe or the royal wardrobe, this was someone who had an official position, and his wife served as a prophet. She said to them, "The Lord, the God of Israel, has spoken. Go back and tell the man who sent you, this is what the Lord says. I am going to bring disaster on this city and its people. All the words written in the scroll that the king of Judah has read will come true. For my people have abandoned me and offered sacrifices to pagan gods, and I am very angry with them for everything they have done. My anger will burn against this place, and it will not be quenched." Again, understanding that God's anger is not against the people, it's against the sin that is separating them from Him. Notice it says the place, not the people. "But go to the king of Judah who sent you to seek the Lord and tell him, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says concerning the message you have just heard. You were sorry and humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard what I said against this city and its people, that this land would be cursed and become desolate. You tore your clothing in despair and wept before me in repentance. And I have indeed heard you, says the Lord. So I will not send the promised disaster until after you have died and been buried in peace. You will not see the disaster I am going to bring on this city." So they took her message back to the king. Now, when we get further on in this book and pace through it, we'll find that there's a period of essentially 22 and a half years from the death of Josiah to the complete emptying of Jerusalem by the king of Babylon. Although the first raid by the king of Babylon would take place approximately, I think 3 years after the death of Josiah. We'll get into that. We might even get into that this evening because, well, I think we have more to read about Josiah first, however. There's another chapter here, chapter 23. So here we are. "Then the king summoned all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem, and the king went up to the temple of the Lord with all the people of Judah and Jerusalem, along with the priests and the prophets, all the people from the least to the greatest. There the king read to them the entire book of the covenant that had been found in the Lord's temple. The king took his place of authority beside the pillar and renewed the covenant in the Lord's presence. He pledged to obey the Lord by keeping all his commands, laws, and decrees with all his heart and soul. In this way he confirmed all the terms of the covenant that were written in the scroll, and all the people pledged themselves to the covenant." Now, recall that this is taking place in the 18th year of his reign. He reigned for 31 years, so we're looking at 13 years left in his reign for these good things to take place. "Then the king instructed Hilkiah the high priest, and the priests of the second rank, and the temple gatekeepers, to remove from the Lord's temple all the articles that were used to worship Baal, Asherah, and all the powers of the heavens. The king had all these things burned outside Jerusalem on the terraces of the Kidron Valley, and he carried the ashes away to Bethel. He did away with the idolatrous priests who had been appointed by the previous kings of Judah, for they had offered sacrifices at the pagan shrines throughout Judah, and even in the vicinity of Jerusalem. They had also offered sacrifices to Baal, and to the sun, the moon, the constellations, and to all the powers of the heavens. The king removed the Asherah pole from the Lord's temple and took it outside Jerusalem to the Kidron Valley, where he burned it. Then he ground the ashes of the pole to dust and threw the dust over the graves of the people. He also tore down the living quarters of the male and female shrine prostitutes that were living inside the temple of the Lord, where the women wove coverings for the Asherah pole. Josiah brought to Jerusalem all the priests who were living in other towns of Judah. He also defiled the pagan shrines where they had offered sacrifices, all the way from Geba to Beersheba. He destroyed the shrines at the entrance to the gate of Joshua, the governor of Jerusalem. This gate was located to the left of the city gate as one enters the city. The priests who had served at the pagan shrines were not allowed to serve at the Lord's altar in Jerusalem. Footnote A. Did not come up to. All right, probably the same meaning. But they were allowed to eat unleavened bread with the other priests. So, in this case, Josiah did not engage in the kind of scorched earth overthrow of the religious order that Jehu had done when he killed all those who worshiped Baal and all their priests, as we read some time ago. Then the king defiled the altar of Topheth in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so that no one could ever again use it to sacrifice a son or daughter in the fire as an offering to Moloch, or to make their children pass through the fire, is what that footnote's going to tell us. He removed from the entrance of the Lord's temple the horse statues that the former kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun. They were near the quarters of Nathan-Melech, the eunuch, an officer of the court. The king also burned the chariots dedicated to the sun. Footnotes B and C. I told you what I thought B said, but we ran across, to make a son or daughter pass through the fire for B, and then C, the meaning of the Hebrew, is uncertain. All right. Josiah tore down the altars that the kings of Judah had built on the palace roof above the upper room of Ahaz. The king destroyed the altars that Manasseh had built in the two courtyards of the Lord's temple. He smashed them to bits and scattered the pieces in the Kidron Valley. The king also desecrated the pagan shrines east of Jerusalem, to the south of the Mount of Corruption, where King Solomon of Israel had built shrines for Ashtoreth, the detestable goddess of the Sidonians, and for Chemosh, the detestable god of the Moabites, and for Molech, the vile god of the Ammonites. Footnote E on Molech. Milcom, a variant spelling of Molech. All right. He smashed the sacred pillars and cut down the Asherah poles. Then he desecrated these places by scattering human bones over them, making them unclean for any sort of worship in that culture, by the way. The king also tore down the altar at Bethel, the pagan shrine that Jeroboam, son of Nebat, had made when he caused Israel to sin. He burned down the shrine and ground it to dust, and he burned the Asherah pole. Then Josiah turned around and noticed several tombs in the side of the hill. He ordered that the bones be brought out, and he burned them on the altar at Bethel to desecrate it. This happened just as the Lord had promised through the man of God when Jeroboam stood beside the altar at the festival. That was several months back. We read the story of how Jeroboam separated from Judah, from Rehoboam, and then in order to prevent the people returning to the reign of David's descendants, he set up these altars at Bethel and Dan so that the people wouldn't have to travel to Jerusalem, which he felt might lead them to revolt against him at some point. And when the man of God from Judah, and that was that strange story we read that involved the lion and the false prophet who lied to him and all the other nonsense that went on there. He had predicted that someone would in the future burn human bones on that altar. And now Josiah fulfills that prophecy. Then Josiah turned and looked up at the tomb of the man of God who had predicted these things. Footnote F, as in the Greek version, the Hebrew lacks when Jeroboam stood at the altar at the festival. Then Josiah turned and looked up at the tomb of the man of God. All right, so they've kind of added what the translators of the Greek version added in this version. What is that monument over there? Josiah asked. And the people of the town told him, it is the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and predicted the very things that you have just done to the altar at Bethel. Josiah replied, leave it alone. Don't disturb his bones. So they did not burn his bones or those of the old prophet from Samaria. Remember, the one who deceived him and got him in trouble. Then Josiah demolished all the buildings at the pagan shrines in the towns of Samaria, just as he had done at Bethel. They had been built by the various kings of Israel and had made the Lord very angry. Footnote G. As in the Greek and Syriac versions in the Latin Vulgate, Hebrew lacks the Lord. All right. He executed the priests of the pagan shrines on their own altars, and he burned human bones on the altars to desecrate them. Finally, he returned to Jerusalem. Now, his motive for doing what he did in the northern kingdom probably escapes us in our day. He may have gone a little bit overboard in his zeal to restore proper worship of God. The people of Israel, the people of the 10 tribes, didn't live in the towns of Samaria anymore. These were other people that the Assyrians had moved there. This narrative doesn't tell us what these people thought of it, how they reacted, what repercussions there were for Josiah in the larger culture of the region, but it probably did have some effect. King Josiah then issued this order to all the people. You must celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God as required in this book of the covenant. There had not been a Passover celebration like that since the time when the judges ruled in Israel, nor throughout all the years of the kings of Israel and Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah's reign, this Passover was celebrated to the Lord in Jerusalem. Now again, when we get into Chronicles, we'll see more language like this, not just for Josiah, but also for Hezekiah. And it'll lead us to question what they're saying. But at any rate, the authors here have looked at the Passover that King Josiah ordered to be celebrated and reached the conclusion that it hadn't been done that way since before the kings took over in Israel. Josiah also got rid of the mediums and psychics, the household gods, the idols, and every other kind of detestable practice, both in Jerusalem and throughout the land of Judah. He did this in obedience to the laws written in the scroll that Hilkiah the priest had found in the Lord's temple. Never before had there been a king like Josiah, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and soul and strength, obeying all the laws of Moses, and there has never been a king like him since. But then the prophets feel like they have to explain what's going to happen shortly, so they add this. Even so, the Lord was very angry with Judah because of all the wicked things Manasseh had done to provoke him. For the Lord had said, I will also banish Judah from my presence, just as I have banished Israel, and I will reject my chosen city of Jerusalem and the temple where my name was to be honored. The rest of the events in Josiah's reign and all his deeds are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Judah. While Josiah was king, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went to the Euphrates River to help the king of Assyria. Now, what we're seeing here is a major political threshold in the region. Up to this point, Assyria had been the dominating force. Egypt is considered a world empire prior to that. And so you've got Egypt, a waning power, Assyria, the existing power, and the Chaldeans, or Babylon, an upcoming power, all coming together in a struggle for military supremacy. And so Pharaoh Necho forms an alliance with the king of Assyria, and while it doesn't say here who it is that they're fighting, it should be pretty obvious that the enemy they both face is the Chaldeans, or Babylon. So it says here, King Josiah and his army marched out to fight him. Footnote I, Josiah went out to meet him. Well, given what happened, he didn't have, doesn't appear that he had the intent to form an alliance. He thought maybe he could win points with the Babylonians by harassing the king of Egypt, Pharaoh Necho. But then it says, but King Necho, footnote J, he is all the Hebrew says, but it makes sense given the context. King Necho killed him when they met at Megiddo. Josiah's officers took his body back in a chariot from Megiddo to Jerusalem and buried him in his own tomb. Then the people of the land anointed Josiah's son Jehoahaz and made him the next king. Now, I will tell you, we'll read through this, but I'm going to tell you now because I'm familiar with this part of the story. 3 sons and 1 grandson of Josiah will reign over Judah over the next 22 and a half years. Now, this is Jehoahaz. Jehoahaz doesn't appear to have been the oldest son of Josiah. Recall, he reigned for 31 years. So it says Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. His mother was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah from Libnah. Now, is this the Jeremiah the prophet? Maybe. I think we can find references to Libnah in Jeremiah's writing. It doesn't say that he had a daughter and named her, but it's likely, which may be why the interpreters think that Manasseh's mother was Isaiah's daughter. Because here we have a king whose mother was Jeremiah's daughter. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight, just as his ancestors had done. Now, let's look at this from Pharaoh Necho's viewpoint. Pharaoh Necho goes to assist the king of Assyria against Babylon. And as he's on his way, this pesky little king from the no-count country of Judah comes out and picks a fight with him. Well, he doesn't have much power. Necho easily puts him down, kills the king, and goes on with what he's doing. But he's not in a good mood about it. This little pesky annoyance was not what he needed. And once he went together with the king of Assyria and tried to take on the Babylonians, he got his proverbial hinder portions handed back to him. So now he's in a really bad mood. So as he goes back to Egypt, he crosses through Judah. What does he do? Pharaoh Necho put Jehoahaz in prison at Riblah in the land of Hamath to prevent him from ruling in Jerusalem. He also demanded that Judah pay 7,500 pounds of silver and 75 pounds of gold as tribute. Essentially, he came to Jerusalem. He made the king of Judah his vassal. He demanded tribute. And then it says, Pharaoh Necho then installed Eliakim, another of Josiah's sons, to reign in place of his father. And he changed Eliakim's name to Jehoiakim. Jehoahaz was taken to Egypt as a prisoner, where he died. In order to get the silver and gold demanded as tribute by Pharaoh Necho, Jehoiakim collected a tax from the people of Judah, requiring them to pay in proportion to their wealth. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, so roughly 2 years older than the brother who took over when his father died. And he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. His mother was Zebidah, the daughter of Pedaiah from Rumah. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight, just as his ancestors had done. Now, we can see why Necho may have done what he did. And so Jehoiakim becomes his vassal. Eliakim, the older brother to, what was the other one? Jehoahaz. Yeah, the older brother to Jehoahaz. Pharaoh Necho puts him in place, says, you be my vassal, and, well, in order to take the throne, he agreed, but it wouldn't matter for long, as we're going to see, because as we've noted, the powers in the world are in flux. The powers in this region of the world are undergoing transition. And the old powers are giving way to the new power, to the Chaldeans, who had built the city of Babylon on the Euphrates River. And from here on out in the story, Assyria and Egypt will get almost no mention, because Babylon will become the primary focus of attention in the region, because it is the new world power of that region. I say world power, regional power. I mean, they didn't have control of China. They didn't have control of the people in what we today call the New World. They probably didn't really have much of a sense that even existed. But for the world that they had access to and were aware of, the Babylonians were preparing to take control of it. And is it Nabonidus, I think, the father of Nebuchadnezzar, is in charge at this point. But Nebuchadnezzar is about to take over, and he will exert his intelligence, his might, his lust for power all over the world, but including in Judah and Jerusalem. And we'll see that it's a rather lengthy story of all the things that go on in that territory in these 22 and a half years that we're talking about, from the death of Josiah and on. Now, something that didn't get mentioned here, I think it is mentioned in the Chronicles. When Josiah died, the prophet Jeremiah wrote laments, because during 31 years the people had developed an attraction to this man. Apparently he had developed the charisma or whatever it took to get the people to go along with his religious reforms, so they were with him, at least for as long as he was alive. Obviously, once he was dead, his sons did what they wanted to do, and the prophets judged that they did evil in the Lord's sight, just as the ancestors had done. I suppose they're speaking of Ahaz, Manasseh, and Amon, the preceding wicked kings. And I'm looking at the time we've got here. We're a little bit short, but we also got started late, and we haven't even been able to put this up because we haven't been able to link up to live in Facebook for whatever reason. Hopefully I will be allowed to upload this video, so it'll be available at some point for everybody to view once it gets uploaded. And we apologize for the problems that what happened. You do updates. The updates are supposed to make things better, but they don't always. You know, humans, to err is human. To really foul things up requires a computer. And we have both humans and computers here, so who knows what could happen. So, as a programming note, the fourth Saturday comes up next week, so probably sometime in the coming week we'll prepare another sermon presentation that we'll do our best to get everything sorted so we can have it up for you. If we have to keep recording, then we'll start recording ahead of time so that we can have them posted in time for you. So we will continue in 2 Kings chapter 24 next week. I don't think there's a lot more left in 2 Kings. And who knows, we may even get into 1 Chronicles. And I will say this. We are not going to try to read through the book of Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, word for word. People would be totally bored to tears over that. There's an awful lot of genealogy in there, and we can talk next week a little bit about why the authors of the book felt this genealogy information was so important. But so we will probably skip over large sections of those books and focus on the parts that are truly historical and have something to say about the events that took place over the period of time that it covers. So we invite you to join us next week when we continue working our way through the Old Testament. And until then, we say goodbye and God bless.